Okay, hello everyone. Welcome to our first webinar of the series Knowledge in Policy Going Beyond Context Matters. And in this first webinar, we will focus our attention on the map. I am happy to see that many of you could join, and I'm saying welcome from Politics and Ideas and from INASP. John Harle, a colleague from INASP, is joining us today. And before we start into the agenda, I'd like to say that today we will be mainly speaking. I'll just turn the video on so that you can see me and give you a warm welcome. But I will need to switch the video off to protect the connection with all of you so that you can hear me well. Sometimes having the video on for some of the bandwidth connections in our countries deters having a good reception. So I switch it off through the chat function there below. Feel free to write your questions and comments as we speak. And as you have seen, turning in and off the audio sometimes takes some time, so we'd rather keep participation to the chat. If any one of you has to or would like to speak because you want to make a large point and it's not, it would take a lot of time to write it down, just let us know and we'll try to give you voice. But preferably, let's keep participation to the chat form so that also all of you can be writing at the same time and we don't need to coordinate that participation through audio. So thanks for being here and your interest. Today we have a quite extensive agenda. Briefly, I'll introduce you to the background of our study. I see some of you that already participated in our webinar where we presented the whole framework that in which we will delve today. Today we will just main dimensions. So I'll talk a little bit about macro context, which is the first large dimension of context. But before that, for those who have not been able to see the whole picture, I'll briefly introduce the study. And then we have John, who will share very interesting reflections and experiences that have to do with one of the factors of the macro context, which is knowledge regimes. And we will wrap up with some final remarks and next steps, especially for those who remain enthusiastic about the framework and want to join us in the upcoming issues of the series. So why context? I know that you can see this in detail right now. I'll show you the larger screen in a couple of minutes, but briefly to let you know the background of our work. As we were working both with policy researchers and policymakers who are very interested in promoting the production and use of knowledge in policy, we realized that we very often talked about the large role of context in enabling the use of knowledge in policy or not, or deterring that. And that usually we all talked about context matters, and when you have go through case studies, people talk again and again about context, but that there was a need to explore with more depth about what is context and why it matters and how it matters most frequently. So we decided to embark this study to understand how does context really operate, and we decided to use context as the place where where the practice of producing research and policy to inform policy is performed, and that natural place where that practice takes place is the governmental institution, the public institution. So our unit of study and the context for us is the governmental institution, and within that governmental institution, of course, we will have, as you see here, different dimensions that account and that tell us about context. And we'll go into detail in some minutes about that. But mainly, when you see this, we are looking into the gray circles are agencies that are interacting among themselves and interacting with other relevant stakeholders within a larger circle, which is the macro context, the large picture. And this is what we will be exploring in depth today. The macro context and its sub-dimensions, how that large picture affects both what happens within each governmental agency, but also in the relationships with other relevant stakeholders. So what we have, and if you're interested in looking in more detail about the different dimensions on this study, I just wanted to briefly mention that we have this conceptual framework with 6 main dimensions that I just showed in the slide before. But we also have a practical paper where we share a set of concrete implications that would help you use this framework. This framework is a lens to which you can apply to different type of interventions addressed to enhance the use of knowledge in policy. So this practical paper has different implications that are targeted to different profiles of users. There are implications for researchers, there are implications for policymakers, there are implications for capacity building experts. So we will share with you this PowerPoint with the links to both the conceptual framework, which is a separate paper, and the practical paper. But today, mainly we will be navigating the interactive product. The interactive product is the space and the way in which we synthesized what we have found and developed both in the conceptual framework and in the practical paper. So both the interactive webinar and the interactive product, and the webinar today are ways of sharing in a more practical way what we have learned through this study. So how do we use it? I mean, we say that we have this conceptual framework. We have this, which is depicted in this graph, which is composed by 6 main large dimensions. How do we use this lens? Why would this lens be useful? Okay, for that we will be exploring the different 6 dimensions in this set. This first webinar, as I told you before, will deal with macro context and how we can use the lens of macro context to identify forces, factors that may affect or be affected by our efforts. And in upcoming webinars, we'll delve into the other large dimensions, which are the intra and interrelationships with state actors and with non-state stakeholders. Then we will also talk about culture, the culture of the governmental agency and how it affects and is affected by the use of knowledge in policy, organizational capacities, the fourth. Then we have management and processes, and finally other resources. So this time we will be looking into macro context and how we can use the lens of macro context, but we invite you to follow us in the upcoming webinars within the series to do the same with each of the dimensions. These are really complex and large dimensions. So we thought it would be worth using the lens of each at one point at a time. So that's what we will do today. Sorry, I went to the future where I stepped into the future too quickly. Right now, I will invite you to explore with me the macro context, and I'll show you let's see if you can see it. I think you cannot see it yet. Hold a second. Screen sharing. I'm about, sorry, it's taking a little bit of time. Tested it, but it was not showing up. Yes, you can see it there, right? Okay, so this is the interactive product that I had just introduced. As you will see here, you have the implications are on the top, interactive product, but today we'll navigate together context. So macro context, as I was mentioning before, is the very big picture that surrounds governmental agencies' work. Macro-context is composed by large forces that include political, economic, social, and cultural systems. Talk about in the next minutes are forces that can be either structural ones or circumstantial factors. Yes, can you hear me well? Well, hello. Yes, okay. I thought that you couldn't hear me well. Okay, so I'll go back to my. Sorry about that. I was that you couldn't hear me well. So let's. These factors, these large forces, as I was mentioning, are two levels. I mean, can be analyzed in two ways. One, some sorts of factors are structural factors. These are factors that rarely change, that could be regarded as constant forces that operate and influence what happens within governmental agencies. And there are other factors that we found in literature in practice that are the circumstantial factors that emerge with a particular weight, and they are a particular weight in the way knowledge is used in policy due to some windows of opportunity that emerge. These are kind of a popular pressure for change when there's like a movement within some groups of stakeholders pushing for change, and in crisis and transitions. These, of course, change and are not constant forces. These really represent specific windows of opportunity to analyze how to use and incorporate research in policy, while the others are the constant factors. And within those, we have discretional decision-making action, usually the type of governance arrangements to play a very important role in how research is incorporated into policy, or not. Literature, our interviews with many practitioners and policymakers, usually when you have settings where there a lot of decisions are taken on a discretionary basis and there's not a large practice of accountability in the way public resources are used or the decisions are made, there's less space incorporated into decision making. When there's a large degree of corruption, rent-seeking, and influence peddling, usually this leads into less essential for research to be used because, of course, decisions are made influenced by these other type of forces, right? And there's more discretion that has to do with usually it's also linked with a second factor is the degree of power distribution. So discretionary decision making usually goes hand in hand with power being centralized and operated from very close and minor groups. And this, of course, closes the doors or diminishes the opportunity to incorporate knowledge into policy. Another subdimension is the strategic planning culture. This can be both at the national but also at the subnational levels. How much policymakers and policy-making agencies are used to do planning. Usually, we have found that when there's a certain degree of planning processes and culture of planning, this opens up the opportunity to incorporate evidence, both to justify decisions, both to also in terms of incorporate evidence that then, or indicators or baselines within planning policy decisions, baselines that then need to be monitored and evaluated. And for that, of course, the window of opportunity to generate new evidence is larger. So there's an opportunity when you are working in environments where there's like ministries are used to do rigorous planning, or there's like national agencies are used to do planning. This can be looking in plans and the way the plans are made and the processes for planning can become good entry points to promote further use of knowledge in policy. But on the other side, an interesting point to make here too is that sometimes the planning can become quite rigid, and in the cases of knowledge that is addressed to introduce new ideas or to contest the way some policy problems are framed, if that's the goal that we have and that the research is more introduced into innovating and to push for innovation, that these policymakers and the whole policymaking processes sometimes will try to keep on course, right? And if we had certain plans, and if they have certain plans, they will be less eager to listen or to receive ideas that would mean a significant variation from what was originally planned. And that's why we all know from policymaking literature that changes are usually gradual and very incremental. So when the planning is a more embedded practice and planning is done in a more rigid way, innovation is less possible. So that type of research that requires significant innovation or change will be probably more quickly disregarded. A third subdimension within macro context is a recurrent one, has to do with the degree of consultation and participation in policy processes. Of course, it's natural to expect that when governments or governmental agencies having these formal ways of opening up for consultation and having other non-state stakeholders participate in the policy processes, these are all significant opportunities for research to be incorporated and for research producers and users to make evidence a piece of the puzzle within these debates and within these discussions around policy. So when they are open and as they are more open and more participatory, there's a larger space for stakeholders who are interested in promoting knowledge into policy to bring this into this more open table. We have knowledge regimes, and I won't go deep into this because John will talk more deeply about them. And we think that if you are thinking about the three previous factors or subdimensions that I found, they are usually very difficult to change, right? If you are thinking from the perspective of a governmental agency, and if you are a change agent or you're working with agents of change, policymakers who are very committed to promote a stronger culture of production and use, the room that you have to influence corruption practices or the way the overall decisions are made, if you're living in countries where the discretionality is quite large, or there's no strategic culture at all, or the processes are quite closed, there's not much that one can do at the individual organizational level. There's some we always, but we think that knowledge regimes and interaction in the way that there's like a machinery of production and use of knowledge can be a very interesting entry point, and John will let us know about some ideas on how to work on this. But probably from the governmental agency or working with a governmental agency, there are some virtuous practices and cycles by interacting with the stakeholders that can lead into strengthening some aspect of the knowledge regime. So we'll get into this soon with John's presentation. Then we have the prevailing policy narratives. This is a very interesting, and this is not a factor or a force that it's talked about so often when we are telling stories about how research has been used or not in policy making. But we have found through literature and talking and interviewing practitioners, mainly policymakers who are trying to strengthen the use of knowledge in policy, that the role of these policy narratives, which are the way that the public is framing and understanding certain policy issues, is very large. And the way that the people and the citizenship and the important groups in different policy issues understand and frame a policy problem really can open up or not opportunities for research to be incorporated into the policy decisions, policy formulations. Where if the knowledge that we want to introduce is really aligned or can shed light into a way of solving or addressing a problem that has become very prominent within a policy narrative, and people are really talking about something, and the research that we want to use, or the research that we want to produce if we are in the research supply side, can link well into that narrative in terms of bringing a potential solution, or in terms of coming up with an answer to a question that within those narratives is being formulated. There will be probably a good opportunity to frame and to tell the story about the research under that narrative, and to really try to use the concepts that are being used on the way that people are talking about a problem or are talking about a policy to come up with new evidence to either complement point of view, complement a question, respond to a question, while when research really not at all linked to something that to the way people are talking about a problem, or even maybe sometimes the policy narratives are not seeing something as a problem. So there we will need to make a larger effort in terms of creating a new narrative, and this of course is not easy at all. So the chances for evidence or new evidence to come into this public space and these narratives are lower. And there's a lot of work to do in terms of communicating and crafting new messengers that can gradually help talk about that issue differently based on what research and evidence is bringing on. Then we have the final large subdimension within this recurrent structural factors is the degree of power distribution in the system. As you see, as I navigate, you can also then go more deeply into each of the factors navigate this, but the degree of the way that power is distributed in a society, whether it's very centralized or very decentralized, of course, brings up a system of checks and balances between the executive, the legislative, and the judicial branches that, again, becomes an opportunity to talk and interact with different actors differently. And this power is more distributed and more centralized. There's more likelihood that research will be used, because you have actors contesting and sometimes negotiating, and you can bring your sorry about that, and you can bring on your new perspectives to these different actors that have different degrees of power in terms of deciding new policies or redesigning existing ones, etc. While usually when there's a lot of concentration of power, the debate becomes less plural, the decisions are made in a more closed way, and if we cannot reach the one or two most power in the decision, the opportunity will really not be there in terms of incorporating the knowledge. This is both applies to those operating outside the state, but also within the state. I mean, if there's you are a governmental agency at the subnational level, and the official party at that jurisdiction or province is not the official party, and the official party is concentrating in the executive power, and 5 or 4 people, most of the decisions, of course, you will have less opportunity to kind of counter argue or come up with new ideas or ways that emerge from research in terms of how national policies that then derive into subnational policies are implemented or crafted. So these are the large usual forces. Of course, have some circumstantial ones, as I talked before, that have to do with specific windows of opportunity, because there's like a large group of citizens that get that try to lobby and advocate for a specific change in the education or security, whatever has to do with what citizens are concerned about, and this becomes a specific window of opportunity for when we're doing research or we have nodes linked to that pressure for change. So policymakers will be more eager to listen to new ideas and to see how to respond to this bigger pressure for change. And of course, we all know that crisis and transitions also, these are changing, changing settings. So whenever there's like a pressure and a forced change that is taking place, this usually, of course, it becomes a more unstable environment, and people are more eager to come up or to come up with ideas, to take on new ideas, to interact with the players, because the way things were being usually done is not working. And finally, I didn't mention this, I should have done it at the very beginning, but this is usually what most of you might be aware about. Within the structural factors, there are larger factors. I have just gone through these 7 set of dimensions that are usually worth exploring in terms of seeing how these forces affect, or we could affect to some degree, some of these forces. There are very large factors that are usually acknowledged in literature and that usually are part of whenever you do a political analysis or you do a country assessment, right? Which are the large descriptions of your political, social, and cultural setting. These have to do with forces really define the context within which government institutions behave, and really can enable a lot of change or not for a better use of knowledge. And with this, I'm talking about factors like the extent of democracy and political freedom, and the extent of freedom in general, academic freedom, media freedom, right? Political freedom. Of course, the more open and diverse voices we have, both in media, in universities, and in the academic system, and democracy, this of course opens up spaces for the debates and discussions to become more informed by evidence. And this also has to do with the extent of culture of evidence use in general, and how civil society groups have input into policy making processes. So basically, these are the I would say little lenses within the large lens of macro context, which are interested. Of course, these are not set in stone and vary in different contexts, but our invitation is for you to kind of think how, when looking through these lenses, the macro context in your own settings would look like, and where are the opportunities and where are the main barriers in terms of promoting the production of use of knowledge in policy. And this, of course, will help you detect entry points, or also select which would be your areas of concern, because if you feel like some are really hindering your efforts and there's not much that you can do from an individual or organizational standpoint, probably you should focus the efforts where there's more fertility to do some degree, incorporate some degree of change. Any questions about these micro lenses within the large lens of context that you would like to pose? If not, we will ask them to come and go deeply into the knowledge regimes and shed some light with more specific examples and experiences. That's our next point, but please, if you have some comments or questions around all these factors that are quite big for sure and sometimes overwhelming, but hopefully organizing them, and we think that structuring them and thinking about how they can affect our efforts is a good way to not overestimate, but not underestimate the weight that macro context will have in any type of intervention that we want to get involved in. So if you have any questions, please type them in the chat. You can then, of course, navigate this on your own and go more deeper into each of the subdimensions, but I hope I've been able to walk you through how this macro context can look like and what are the main forces that operate within it. Questions? No? Should we move on then? Okay. I think yes. John, if you want to start switching your audio on, and in the meantime, until John comes, if any question or comment comes, yes, Denia, go ahead. I'd love to have that question in, so come in. In the meantime, John begins switching on your audio so that then I can turn. I'll let for Denia, and if others. I see, John, yes, we can hear you already, but let's wait for the question that it's coming in. Oh, here it is. Thank you. So Daniel said that where the different dimensions of the macro context are presented, it seems lead to no intersectionality between them. Yes, interplay. Yes, good point. And I, for the sake of clarity, we left many arrows out. But yes, indeed, we agree. We have a systemic approach to macro context, and of course, these different forces interact with each other. Let me go again to the just to provide an example. You can see. Let's see if you can see the chart again. When thinking about these subdimensions, I try to make the link between one of them and the other one, which is the degree of power distribution and the level of dispersonality that you have among decision making. Of course, that when you are when you have systems where dispersonality and corruption and rent seeking are large, probably these cultures of decision making won't be prone to do planning and to have to present public plans on the way they devise policies to be implemented. So these factors are indeed connected to each other, and usually when you have for instance, systems where the power is more equally distributed and there are good check and balances, these type of systems are usually more open to consent and are more open to have participation from other stakeholders, which then, of course, would dictate the level of discretionality in the way decisions are made. So, indeed, there's a lot of interaction. The reason why we decide to look at each of them separated is because in way literature analysis context. And when we spoke with policymakers in different countries of the world, and they were telling stories about how their cultures are open or not to produce and use knowledge in policy, these are the ways that people usually talked about macro context and the large forces that usually played a heavy role in their everyday work. And we wanted to kind of tell within this macro lens where everything is interrelated, to pay special attention to some of these sub-dimensions. And there's, as I told you before, within the implications, then there are ways to kind of think about each of them and their relationships to see where your potential of change is. If within for instance, a smaller agency, you decide to embark on a plan and do things differently, even though the large setting is not used to do some planning, and you see that at some high level decisions there's a lot of discretionality, you might start just trying to build your efforts around what would happen if we do have a plan, and within that plan, what would happen if we have one specific point of consultation or participation of certain that will bring input knowledge into our plan. And of course that then maybe the final plan and the way implemented will be severely or heavily affected by some political decisions where research plays no role, and it's very heavy in terms of ideologies or the way power is distributed and who will make a favor to whom. And the plan will not look exactly as you would like, but it's a first step. These are all processes, and maybe that plan and the way you can implement it can also show benefits for those who are more used to make decisions in a discretionary way, to be able through the plan to have support from some external stakeholders or knowledge producers who, with government change, stay there. And so building, and I think that John will delve more deeply into this, sometimes a good way to have a systemic approach and to realize that there are connections is to work systemically too, in terms of bringing on the other champions or agents of change. It could be in other governmental agencies, but also non-state stakeholders who are eager to work this way, and build these little tiny clusters where things are done differently, and where you continue to be affected by the overall forces where there's like maybe power is not distributed or it's not executed in the political system in the way we would like to, or there's most of the spaces are quite close in terms of opening up policy processes. There are tiny steps and baby steps that we can make in terms of generating other ways of doing things, and hopefully that could, in the long term, permeate some of those large forces. So it's worth considering which of those are really important in your specific intervention, in your specific setting, and where there's really space to come or to kind of build on opportunities, and then having all those other forces and things that happen as a reaction to your small changes, the ripple effects in the large forces that you need to be watching, and to see how you can deal with them, acknowledging that probably these forces won't change in the short term or affect to some degree your effort, but there's always some room for maneuver. And this lens we offer is to really go through all of them and to see where for you is the space or the entry point where there's some change that can be produced, regardless of the macro context, which is so large, and of course it's too big and has a lot of weight to us think from an individual organization standpoint that we can affect it largely. We will be mostly affected, but there are within those subdimensions usually entry points, and we consider. I think this leads nicely into John's presentation. We think that working within your knowledge regime and looking into what others could do or are doing is a good way to start. So I hope this helps, Tenia. I invite you also to go, great. I also invite you, specifically because of your question, I invite you to visit within the interactive project. We have in the top part, we have implications for different type of users, but we also have implications to embrace complexity. And what your question is really linked to complexity and to having a complex approach. And there you will see that we have like 4 ways to better incorporate complexity and acknowledge these interplays. I invite you to go more into detail into those ways to do it. One is using perspective, for instance, and discussing this to see the links. What is the interplay for your setting right now, not only from your standpoint, but also talk with other people about that and bring other perspectives to bring and to become more collectively aware of those interplays and where the space for reform or change is. So I think that you might find more. We don't have a lot of text to delve deeply, and I need to invite John to speak right now. But go to that space where we will find more ideas about that are related to your question. But definitely, we take a complex approach. At the same time, we need to isolate and look into the forces as they were separate to kind of understand them and see where we are. But then we also need to see the connections between them. So that being said, John, thank you for being here. I'll let you step in and continue the webinar with your thoughts about knowledge regime.
Thanks, Vanessa. Can you hear me okay? You can all hear me okay? Yeah, okay, great. So I'm John Harle. I direct something at INASP called the Strengthening Research and Knowledge Systems Programme. I think Denny has actually given us quite a good starting off point here. So I think you're absolutely right about the, as I was going through this, I could see that it was really hard to keep within the boxes at times. Things flow across this kind of framework. I think it's useful as a way to help us ask the right questions, but not to try and keep within the boxes. But I was asked to talk about the knowledge regimes section, and which at P&I have referred to as the organizational and institutional machinery is to generate research and data and support its uptake. And I think that's an interesting way to look at it. We're interested in research and knowledge systems at INASP, and about how all the organizations and institutions and individuals in a very complex national system interact with each other to generate research, to use research, and that's what I will try and draw on today. Most of my examples are probably going to be drawn from Africa, so apologies for that, but it's where I'm most familiar with some of the examples, the institutions I want to use. So the first aspect of the knowledge regimes in the framework is data and information, how available it is. It's a big theme of the Sustainable Development Goals debate, the need for more and better data to track development progress in a whole manner of fields and sectors, the need to improve the coverage and the granularity of that data, so whether it's disaggregating it by gender or geographically. Morten Jerven's book is an interesting place to start. He's created some pretty big waves with his writings about the generation and the use of data across Africa. And he gives an account of a conversation in Zambia. He'd been there 3 years previously, and he returned. And he's talking about how Zambia's statisticians were struggling to develop the domestic capacity to develop data on the national economy, because they were often required to develop stats indicators to report on the MDGs, on the Millennium Development Goals. And when he visited the central stats office in Lusaka. He'd been there 3 years previously. He found there was only one member of the economic stats division. There had been 3. 2 had moved from economic stats to social and demographic stats because there was more donor funding to work on those areas, more attractive per diems. And while he was there, he says the phone rang and a donor urgently needed someone to help them finish a report. Their own statistician had travelled abroad, and so he says temporarily the last remaining Zambian economic statistician left the office. And this is his kind of comment on the real constraints facing many national governments to generate good data and good stats. We had an interesting meeting earlier on this year in Kenya with a fairly new think tank called the Local Development Research Institute, and they're working with various partners in Kenya and with the Office of the President, I think, to launch the first Kenya Data Forum. And from that, different sectoral groups had emerged. So one looking at educational data and bringing together various think tanks and research teams who are interested in the quality of data for educational policy and planning. And the LDRI, they were starting out by mapping the data available in Kenya, the official data, which could be used to report against all the many SDG indicators, and seeing where the gaps were. And they said, well, only official data can be used, but there are lots of gaps. And so they were thinking about how other data gathered by universities, by think tanks, might be used to demonstrate to government the importance of adopting, developing official data capacity indicators in those areas. When we were preparing for this presentation, Vanessa mentioned an example from Argentina where there are problems with some of the government data. So one of the universities actually compiled the poverty-related data for a number of years. So I think it'd be interesting to sort of hear from others whether they feel there's an opportunity there for kind of other players to be involved in supporting the generation of better data. There's also a huge amount of existing research evidence knowledge around. This is a picture here of the team that leads the Kenya Library and Information Services Consortium, and their role is to make sure that researchers and students in Kenya's universities, in think tanks, in government agencies, teaching hospitals, they have access to the research they need, so academic journals, books, databases. They negotiate with publishers and they train the library staff, and they've made just short of 60,000 individual titles available to around 120 institutions in Kenya. I mention this because there's a huge volume of research available. Often it's not used as much as can be, but actually providing access to that at a national level is incredibly complicated. They have to deal with have to negotiate with publishers, they have to tackle the IT and technical aspects, and so although open access is opening up a lot of academic research, a huge amount still does exist in subscription formats behind paywalls, and so these national organisations play a really important role in making that information available at a national level and doing what individual institutions can't do on their own. But making information available is only one step. It needs to be used. It needs to be the demand and the skills and the interest in using it. And INASP, our evidence-informed policymaking team, working as part of the BACUCO programme, worked with partners in Ghana and Zimbabwe and Uganda to develop an evidence-informed policymaking course, and so this has been used to run training for civil servants, for parliamentary researchers, for those in policy agencies, either in central government or in decentralised agencies, looking at how to find information, how praise it and how to make use of what exists in research. And so I think this is a really important component, not only making data available, but the skills to use it. The next aspect that the P&I framework looks at is funding, and I think a lack of funding is a pretty standard complaint. The graph on the left shows what countries across the world spend on research as a proportion of their GDP. You have Israel, Japan, Korea, Finland, and Sweden at the very top, spending up to 4% of GDP. At the bottom, Chile, Romania, Mexico, Argentina, and South Africa spending around or under 1%. Not on that list. I think Brazil is the highest investor in research as a proportion of GDP. In Latin America, it spends 1.2% of its GDP. In East Africa, Kenya invests just under 1%. Across the world, governments are investing more in research, but a lot of countries still rely on international funding. I thought these were particularly starting figures. So just under 50% of the budget in Kenya for research comes from international donors, more than 50% in Uganda, almost 80% in Mozambique. So that's quite a high proportion. It's actually a slightly better story in some other countries. Ghana, 30% of its research funding comes from international donors, and in South Africa, 12%. So it'd be interesting to know if that's where the other sources of funding are, but that would suggest that much more local investment in research. But I think it's easy to talk about money, but I think what's particularly important to think about is how money shapes agendas. So the fact that so much funding comes from international donors, I think inevitably can lead to a mismatch between needs and demand in a country and the kind of areas which get the most research, which become researchable. And that's not to blame the donors. I think many make efforts to align with national priorities, but that's obviously very different to setting your own research agenda and having the money to spend on that. There's a quote here from a Somali researcher about the many different ways in which international funding, donor funding, starts to influence the way research is done. There have been some quite positive developments though in recent years. So Kenya now has a national research fund, investing a lot more. Also based in Kenya at the African Academy of Sciences, there's a new initiative called AISA, Accelerating Excellence for Science in Africa, where a group of international donors have actually invested their money in an African research council, which will become an African grant maker. So I think that's a positive trend. Obviously, it's not just about funding research, it's about funding research systems, and I think that's often neglected. So the things which are perhaps less exciting to think about, not the research studies or policy work, but the kind of foundational infrastructure, the libraries, the information systems, the ICT, the mechanisms for local publishing to make sure research produced locally can be made visible and communicated. So we are involved at INASP with a number of journals online initiatives which support national bodies to develop platforms for journals publishing in Bangladesh, in Sri Lanka, and in other countries. I think it's also interesting to think not just about the production of new research, but how existing research is brought together, synthesized, and existing brokered. So in Uganda in March, there was an outbreak of Rift Valley fever, and the epidemiological control measures, which are designed to limit the spread of disease, they don't consider the reality for the people affected. So if dairy and meat sales have been banned, what do rural communities eat? Quite often the kind of message comes from a public health body, which might not be the most trusted voice in a rural community. So I think there's a lot here to explore about the ways in which that research system can support research to be communicated, synthesized, used more effectively. The labour market is obviously an important factor. So how many trained researchers are there in a country? The graph on the right shows the number of PhD and master's holders in a number of African universities amongst the academic staff. Botswana is the highest there, and Eduardo Mondlane in Mozambique has the lowest number of PhD qualified staff. It's important because it gives an indication of what Nico Klute and his colleagues at Chet in South Africa have called the academic core, and their argument is quite simply that you need sufficient numbers of trained researchers in a university if it's going to produce high quality research and provide high quality research training for future generations. And that's much more things. So the graph on the right there shows how many graduates at master's and PhD level are coming out of those same African universities, and you can see that relatively few PhD students graduating per year. So that was a few years ago in 2011. Nairobi produced 60 PhD students across the university. Eduardo Mondlane produced a couple, so most of the production is at master's level in those institutions. So there's some questions there, I think, about what is the role for research trained individuals. Does a greater number of research trained staff working in policy positions help evidence to be used as part of policy processes? Finally, there's the consultancy question here. So consultancy is an important mechanism for academic and policy world to be connected. Many academics do work for the national government agencies or for international agencies. That's obviously an important way in which academic research does connect itself to more responsive day-to-day research work. But it's also a problem sometimes, as it can act as a drain on capacity, just as universities are trying to strengthen their capacity. Danny White here was doing a study in Uganda of health research, and one of his informants said to him, one of the universities there, you know, most of our social scientists, they're not based in the institution, they're basically there for hire, they're kind of renting themselves out by the hour or by the day, and that's really a problem for us as we try and develop our research strength. Again, in Uganda, Babu Bandani talks about the NGOization of research. So that academics are in research institutions are sort of losing their kind of time spent doing academic quality work. And it'd be interesting to hear what others think about that, about those tensions between applied research, basic scientific or scholarly research, and how those can be better connected, and one isn't thwarting the other. Just to answer Denny's question there, that last slide referred to academics across the university, so in all subject areas. As far as I know, I'd have to check the original source. I was really pleased to see the mention of critical thinking in the P&I framework. We often talk about research skills and the qualifications of researchers. Obviously, underpinning these are the basic skills to critically assess problems, ideas, go through the literature, go through the evidence base. And that takes us right back to the kind of foundations in universities, the undergraduate teaching programs. Dan Ajita was writing about history teaching at undergraduate level in Zimbabwe, and she was reflecting on the fact that even though there's much more information available now, there are online journals and books available to students, much more easily accessible. It didn't seem to be changing much, and she realised that it was because students weren't being encouraged to think and to critically engage with their lecturers. They were being rewarded essentially for repeating what the lecturers told them, and that was fundamentally undermining their ability to develop those skills to think and appraise information critically. It's obviously a pipeline issue, so I guess that most people working in a policy role, if they haven't studied at postgraduate level, have come out of the university system. Of course, the university system, it depends on educational quality schooling at primary and secondary level. We've tended to assume that university education develops critical thinking skills. There's some work which a colleague in London, Rebecca Shendel, did in Rwanda just to explore that in a bit more depth, and she found that actually, for the most part, the assumption that university education developed critical thinkers, students who are able to take a problem apart, analyse its different dimensions, it didn't entirely hold. There's some questions there about approaches to teaching and assessment, and the way students are supported to learn, which I think are important to answer. But there are some really encouraging new initiatives as well, particularly around the policy work. 13 universities in Africa have come together across the continent to develop the Masters of Research and Public Policy, which is a shared curriculum using case-based teaching for public policy. It'd be interesting to know what else is happening in this space in the countries, the regions you're from. Where kind of interesting teaching, interesting approaches to student learning are being explored. The knowledge regimes part of the framework also talks about the capacity to conduct policy relevant research. It's obviously a concern for many of us, judging by the blogs every week, blogs and articles, either lamenting the kind of disconnects or offering new ways in which academics and NGOs or policy staff can work together. There were some really interesting discussions at the Weyrauch Symposium a few weeks ago in Accra on this, and exploring the sort of differing, sometimes divergent interests, sometimes the lack of understanding between different communities of researchers, policymakers, also some sort of practical suggestions. And I think a comment from Weyrauch, who works in one of the decentralised agencies of the Ghanaian government, working on gender was important, which was unless we start together, we aren't going to end up with research which is policy relevant. And this then highlights the importance, I think, of incentives. So a lot of academics are working in a system where they're not rewarded for that kind of engagement. Their reward comes from producing journal articles, which other academics read, and which are ideally in high impact journals, because that's what earns universities higher scores on the international ranking systems. So I think it can be very hard for universities to, for academics within universities who are interested in where their work connects to policy, to actually do that. And Candelaria at the Ateneo de Manila University in the Philippines talked about this again in Accra at our symposium. And she said that although her university has a really strong social mission, so community service is embedded in student curricula, academics are rewarded still for the articles that they publish in the top journals, not for any outreach work they do. It's because it's the journal articles which earn the university higher placing in the ranking, secures its prestige, helps to attract future students. But it meant that her work with local government, she was working with education officials at district and town level, she was having to sacrifice her individual career progression in order to connect her work with policy and practice, and had to defend that as an important and valuable contribution to knowledge in her discipline. And then the final part of the knowledge regimes component that P&I have highlighted is the social value of science. And here, hopefully, there's a kind of encouraging story. So I found this article from 10 years ago where Georgia Segbe at CSIR, the Council for Science and Industrial Research in Ghana, sort of saying he didn't see a science culture in Ghana and it was sorely lacking. I think the symposium we had a few weeks ago, and particularly we had a national stakeholder forum for Ghanaian policymakers and others interested in research to policy process in Ghana, tells a more positive story, that actually evidence is increasingly valued in Ghanaian policymaking. So we heard from Dr. Isaac Mensah-Bonsu of the National Development Planning Commission, who talked about how the Commission draws on a range of evidence, citizen consultations, censuses and surveys, as well as research reports by think tanks and universities, and that it gathers evidence right from the district level up, and eventually, through this process, reports back to Parliament and to the Presidency. Similarly, at the continental level, the African Union, that's the AU on the right there, has made a very clear statement about the importance of research, science, higher education to the continent's development plan. And so we're seeing a much attention being given to research and science. But I think finally it's just worth reflecting on another aspect of how science is valued socially, and I think Ebola gives a particularly sort of cautionary tale here. So this is a new book by Paul Richards, an anthropologist who's based at Njala University in Sierra Leone, and he shows how the tendency to ignore local knowledge and local beliefs actually made it much harder for the outbreak to be contained initially, for all the kind of scientific and technical knowledge of epidemiologists and medical professionals. But once that local knowledge and understanding of local beliefs and practices was mixed into that epidemiological medical knowledge, the outbreak actually came under control a lot faster than had been expected initially. So I think there's some interesting questions there, looking at how science is valued socially, not just by the kind of elites in science agencies and research institutes, but actually by local people whose lives science research knowledge seeks to impact on, seeks to improve. So I said at the beginning that we talk about a research and knowledge system at INASP, and this is our kind of very quick sketch of all the different parts we see that are important in that research system. I think what's important to us and we discussed it again in Ghana the week, is that we need to think beyond just the obvious institutions, the research institutions, and the policy institutions, and recognise a whole other range of organisations and the individuals within them who play an important role in making research accessible, making research visible, communicating research, synthesizing research, playing a brokering role. So this research system is a complex and often messy space. It's much more than the sum of its individual parts. It's changing and shifting. Lots of different and sometimes divergent interests and agendas and capacities. But there are also people able to move across those boundaries. And I think Anne's example of her work on Filipino educational policy speaks very well to that. So I think I'll end there, hopefully on time, and hopefully there's interesting things to contribute to the debate there, more kind of examples and stories than they are Thanks very much.
Thank you, John. I think you brought in a lot of very concrete examples from different countries on how the knowledge regimes within macro context can be explored and used as driving forces to support our efforts. So thanks for that. I'd like to invite, before wrapping up, I'd like to invite participants if they have any comments or questions around John's presentation, just to step in through the chat, or any other comments or reflections about macro context in general. No? Okay, I'll leave you as I wrap up. If anyone wants to come in with any comment, you're welcome. So as we have explored today, macro context is for sure that this really large picture with large forces that sometimes leave us a little bit overwhelmed and doubtful about how we can really use this lens to think better about our interventions. But hopefully, by using all these reflections and looking into these sub-dimensions that we have explored together today, it's a good way to see which areas should be under our concern, and we should be tracking to see how they could either support or heavily affect any type of effort. We need to bring them into the table to make more strategic decisions. I see here that Denia is adding that she agrees on the issue of a culture and how this enables or not integration of knowledge in the greater social. Yeah, that's a problem, and that's why when we think about these knowledge regimes, we need to think about the cultural aspect of how knowledge is usually produced, regarded, and the type of how we consider what we consider that knowledge is not, and how this is embedded in the whole context. And again, it's a big problem, but again, there are very specific and concrete ways in which we can start when, for example, interacting with an academic organization or academic researchers to begin thinking about these issues and how we can move a little bit ahead in terms of making knowledge more relevant for the society in general. I see here that Marilia is also typing in. Okay. And, she's saying that she will need to go more time and to go through all these things that we have seen. We agree on this point that you are making, Marilia, about how science communication is regarded and dealt with other audiences, not only academia. In fact, as you will see here in our slide, we plan to explore interrelationships in depth in March in our webinar. These are, I mean, we don't have established dates for January, February, and March yet, because we're interacting with current or former policymakers. The upcoming webinars will always have a guest policymaker, as a guest who will share his or her experience regarding the other large dimensions and bring on dilemmas and concrete practices that they have seen in place to work from each dimension. Again, of course, that these dimensions are interrelated as we go to them. Today, we are talking about some of the changes within knowledge regimes, the role of leaders and agencies of change comes out. So, of course, that we need to see through the whole lens. And in sense, for those who didn't attend our webinar on the whole conceptual framework, we invite you to do that. Maybe that's a good way to start looking into the picture and seeing how the different dimensions interplay, because in the upcoming webinars, we will be focusing, we're using some specific lenses and delving more deeply into some aspects, which are, again, are integrated and interrelated with others. But the first launch webinar, where we presented the interactive product, we talked about this whole systemic view that we need to take in. So hopefully, for those who haven't subscribed yet for the whole series, you can see there what's coming up. Please drop us an email to contact at politics. Leandro, if you can type there the email to which they can write if you want to be kept in the loop. But also sometimes the dates might be not suitable for your agendas. We're recording all these sessions, so today we will send the PowerPoint presentations on the recorded version. You might have some colleagues that maybe would like to listen to this webinar. And if you cannot make it to the upcoming ones, if you subscribe, we'll keep you in the loop and send you presentations and recorded webinars as they come in, so that you can, if interested, attend the whole series. So thank you very much for today and for your comments and questions. We hope that we see you again in November, where we will talk about the resources, budget. Like budget is linked, it's like the organizational lens or way to look into the funding, the large force of funding that John talked about today. But we'll also talk about the legal restraints or legal capacities to commission and use research in policy. So please join us. And thank you for all your comments. We really enjoyed having you here, and we hope to see you again. Any comments or further questions, please drop us a line. And here, before leaving, if you can just send your votes. We would like to hear some feedback about the webinar today and what you liked and you did not like, so that in November we can improve the way we are sharing knowledge with you. Thanks a lot, and we'll be in touch through email with the recorded version and the PowerPoint presentations. Please give us some feedback. Bye-bye now.